never thought British establishment surrendered to drugs, right here. The abolition of Britain and the Cameron delusion. He has debated the issue of drugs in public on many occasions, including debating against that hideous hippie Russell Brand, former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, and actor Matthew Perry. Peter has debated on BBC Question Time, Newsnight, Sunday Morning Live, Sky News, and many others. Peter Hitchens does not believe in the existence of addiction as it is just a philosophical concept made to relieve people of responsibility for their actions. This view and many more controversial views I'm sure we can discuss today. The format tonight will work as follows. First of all, Peter will put forward his position about the lack of law enforcement on drugs in this country, along with the potential solutions. Upon the conclusion of this, we will open questions up to the floor, where we'll have a question and answer session where you may ask any question of your choice. I ask that you remain respectful in the debate to those who may disagree with you, and I also, a couple of disclaimers. I must make it clear, this is an event organised by UKIP, but UKIP does not endorse Peter Hitchens, nor does Peter Hitchens endorse UKIP. And also, we are Facebook live streaming this event, so be aware that anything you do say may be on camera. And it is now my pleasure to present to you Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens.
Thank you so much. For connoisseurs of memes, I'd like to point out that this cup of tea contains contraband substance, namely full-fat milk. Smuggled under the campus by Will here, because there isn't any, as far as I know, to be found. Extraordinary, isn't it? That it's probably easier to get cannabis on your campus than it is to get full-fat milk. 2 times change. I like to begin these things by taking a couple of short surveys. The first one is to ask all of you who think that you have a completely open mind, please raise your hands. Right, you're going to have to prove it. Secondly, to ask you, and there is absolutely no danger in this, I assure you, if you think there is, you'll learn otherwise during the following minutes. Any of you who have taken any illegal drug at any stage, do please raise your hands. Some of you are in fact being coy, friends and neighbours know. Having witnessed that little demonstration, you will be aware that the idea that there is some kind of savage prohibitionary war on drugs in this country is an absurdity. If it were true, first of all, you wouldn't have done it, and secondly, you wouldn't have been stupid enough to put your hands up and admit to having committed a criminal offence. Though criminal offence it is to possess drugs which you have illegally used, in some cases earning a prison sentence currently of 7 years, theoretically. And it's that theoretically that I wanted to deal with, because there's an extraordinary thing going on. If anybody has a serious cough, I can probably nip out and get you some cough sweets, otherwise please do try and suppress it. It sounds terrible on YouTube, and it's preserved for years afterwards. You'll feel really embarrassed that it was you. Is that enough coughing? Good. You really can get a grip and control it. Anyway, the point here about is that I was trying to deal with before the coughing broke out was that there is a fiction in this country about drug policy. A fiction which some people continue to promote. People such as my frequent opponent in these matters, Sir Simon Jenkins, the former editor of The Times, a paragon of respectability, who writes books about cathedrals and parish churches, but who also believes that the law in this country is repressive and should be entirely dispensed with, and that drugs should be made legal. Part of this, the point of this argument is as follows. There is in the world at the moment something which I describe as billionaire big dope. Now most of you, I imagine, would drink fair trade coffee and feel certainly a certain amount of disapproval towards the makers of greasy burgers and sugary drinks as people who exploit the world for money and perhaps sell things which aren't particularly good for their consumers and make a profit out of it and don't actually much mind. And I'm sure almost all of you have a pretty stern view of big tobacco, which for many, many years happily continued to promote a substance which, if used according to the maker's instructions, will make the consumer either seriously ill or dead. So you would have that view on those substances and on the people who sell them. And yet, when confronted with my principal adversary, what I call billionaire Big Doe. And if you go to my blog, you will find details of who these billionaires are and that they do exist. This enormously powerful commercial lobby for the public sale and now advertising of a substance whose danger seems to be very close to being proved and which is strongly correlated with serious lifelong mental illness. And I say correlated because I can't go no further, not being able to establish causation. That you might be more disapproving, it would seem to me, than most of you probably are of this particular lobby. And if it were selling any other substance or proposing the open legal sale of any other substance so damaging to the public and proposing to make money out of it, you'd disapprove of it. And you may, if you want to keep your minds open, you may consider why it is that you have been suckered by this argument. But one of its most important thrusts at the moment is in trying to not merely undermine the existing laws in Western countries, because in most cases these simply aren't actually applied. That is to say, if you examine either the United States, contrary to myth, or any country in Western or Central Europe, you will find, including particularly this one, you will find that the laws against possession, particularly of cannabis, but in truth of several other drugs supposedly more dangerous, is not actually applied with any rigor or consistency, or in many cases at all. It doesn't really exist. What they want to move on to from that is to undermine the reason why we have those laws in the first place, and that is very important. A series of international conventions to which this country is obliged to subscribe by its membership of the United Nations and because it is a member of the Security Council of the United Nations. You can't be a member of the Security Council of the United Nations and ignore treaty obligations which say you have to maintain laws against certain drugs. What you can do is you can maintain the laws and not enforce them. And that's what's happened. But the next thing, which the people who want to sell this stuff and advertise it, and this is particularly, if you look at Proposition 64, which was recently passed in California and is the model for legalization of cannabis probably in the whole world, you will find it contains, it's very long, it contains lengthy provisions for the advertising, which would presumably include television and of course the internet, the advertising of marijuana openly in society very soon after it's legalized. A number of other people are extremely greedy for the taxation which legalized marijuana would bring about. There isn't an exchequer in the world, there's no treasury in the world which is not short of money, and which isn't longing for something to replace the money it's recently lost from the decline in cigarette smoking and the loss of tax which has resulted. So there are some very powerful, greedy, rather unpleasant lobbies which want to see this happen, and they are working on the United Nations very hard at the moment to get that international treaty rescinded. And to make things they like to do is to pretend that the laws against these drugs are much more stringently enforced than they are, and also to pretend, which they do very vigorously, that the problems which are caused by drugs in this country and indeed in the world are caused not by the drugs being bought and consumed, but by the laws against them. It's just fictional. Now there is a history of this, and I owe almost all of my knowledge of it to a man called Steve Abrams, who sadly died a few years ago while I was finishing this book. Steve Abrams was a very clever man and a charming and humorous man, and I rather liked him during the telephone exchanges we had. He was too ill to come and meet me during his final years. But he wrote a very interesting paper on what happened in 1967 in this country, 50 years ago, a subject on which I'm currently trying to make a radio program, which was the publication of the Times newspaper, which at that time was a far more important, far more respectable, far more influential, and far more conservative organ than it is now. The publication of the Times newspaper of a full-page advertisement signed by 64 notable people, including all 4 of the Beatles, calling for the end of the existing laws against marijuana, as everyone then called it. This was a fantastically successful stroke. It led to the creation, it's described in my book, of the Special Wooden Commission, which effectively examined no other drug apart from marijuana, which gave it not exactly a clean bill of health, but a very, very good write-up, which enabled the thing to happen which its progenitors really, really wanted, which was that from the beginning of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, cannabis was classified separately from the bogeyman drugs. LSD then particularly feared, heroin and cocaine. It was given a separate status, and a status as a so-called soft drug. Soft, I think I can persuade many of you later, is a very poor description of it. And secondly, they achieved another distinction. They said the punishment for possession would be lighter and completely separate from the punishment for trafficking. you'll have to explain to me why that would be. If it is wrong to traffic in any substance, then why would it be either a good deal less wrong or in practice not wrong at all to consume it? If the people who import cocaine and heroin, and to some extent there's largely a domestic industry now, marijuana into this country, were importing instead soap, there would be absolutely no reason to prosecute them on trouble, would there? Because soap doesn't do any harm to its users. But what does do harm to its users is the kind of drug that we're speaking of. But the funny thing is, while the trafficking of the drug is illegal and frowned on and described as vile, and people have all their money taken away when they're caught doing it, and they're thrown into prison for quite long periods of time, the actual consumption of it, the reason why the trafficking of the thing is prosecuted in the first place, the actual consumption of it is barely prosecuted at all. Now, I've spent a lot of time since studying the Reformation trying to work out the significance of transubstantiation in the Roman Catholic faith. I find it a very complicated issue and quite tough to get my head around. But by comparison with working out why it's legal to smoke cannabis and hideously illegal to traffic it, I have absolutely no way of working it out. It is completely beyond me, and I don't understand it. This is what they achieved. And that was done in 1971 by the Misuse of Drugs Bill, which is one of the most fascinating acts of Parliament ever to go through the Parliament of this country, for this extraordinary reason. No other act or bill has ever had this privilege. It was presented twice, once by the Labour Party and once by the Conservative Party, in identical form. It only failed to become law in 1970 because an unexpected general election was called. The same bill, word for word, was then presented by the Conservative Party to the Parliament, which came in 1970 and became law in 1971. Quentin Hogg, Lord Hailsham, famous in his day as a rather spectacularly conservative, became Lord Chancellor, a man who in 1967 had railed against the signatories of the pro-marijuana advertisement I mentioned earlier. By 1973, was making completely different speeches to the Magistrates Association, which is the body of all magistrates in the country, the people who hear most drug cases, telling them to cease from then on to send anybody to prison for possession of cannabis. Since then, as Steve Abrams told me, the penalties for possession of cannabis have in practice gone down and down and down and down, until in effect, I could go on much longer about this, but I won't, because I want to stimulate questions as soon as possible, until at the moment the situation is that the police have themselves, without consulting Parliament, introduced something called the Cannabis Warning, which is not recorded centrally, which has no effect on a person's criminal rate, and which indeed has no effect on anything at all, which is the preferred response of the National Police Chiefs Council to finding anyone in possession of cannabis. When this was first introduced, quite a few of them were issued. But over the past 10 years, the numbers of cannabis warnings given out has fallen precipitously until it's approaching only a few thousand. The reason for this is not that people have stopped possessing or smoking cannabis. The reason is that the police have stopped bothering to do anything about it, and sooner or later they will do nothing about it at all. And that was the great achievement of the 1967 advertisement, of the Wooden Committee of 1969, of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, and of conservative politicians such as Lord